I'm going to be talking about the anti-establishment movement of the late 1960s that led to the great influence of the Vietnam War, which has transformed into the same mentality that is projected through the skateboarding culture of today. Along with David Dillard and Addy, we are going to discuss and analyze an intellectual movement in society that led to the great industrial age of art, poetry, and music. However, the catastrophic events of the First World War, the Great Depression, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy all led to the decline of this romantic movement. So please indulge yourself into the death of Romanticism.
Head in the sky, it's okay, I know nothing's wrong, nothing.
The cultural impact of the First Great World War is still felt today. Perhaps because we hear so much of the war, we've grown insensitive to the amount of devastation that truly occurred. We hear of one death and think it's a tragedy. We hear 2 million died in a battle and think it's simply a statistic. Try to bring the statistics home a little bit. World War I alone destroyed over 4% of the entire population of France, more than 16% of the entire population of Serbia. For the United States to lose that much of its population, the entire states of New York and California would have to be obliterated. More than 60 million Europeans were mobilized for the war, and more than 35 million died. Before the horrific wars of the 20th century, man had faith in technology, and some believed that science would do away with war altogether. It was an age of great progress. The first airplanes, cars, zeppelins, instant coffee, and great ships such as the Titanic were all from this period. But World War I demonstrated that technology simply made it easier to kill others, and countless soldiers died in the trenches to machine guns and mustard gas. The sheer brutality of modern warfare was so severe that many soldiers endured lasting psychological trauma from the war. Over the trenches, soldiers would make desperate rushes at the enemy machine gun nests, and thousands died over tiny, insignificant portions of ground. There was no glory in their battle, and no real significance in their deaths. Technology offered nothing but a quicker, or in the case of mustard gas, a more painful death. The First World War severely weakened man's faith in technology and in man himself. The results were obvious. For instance, 20 years earlier, Mark Twain had written Huckleberry Finn, exalting man's independence and individuality, while 20 years later, Walden 2 was being written, and psychologists were concerned with controlling, manipulating, and conditioning mankind. The Great War made people realize that technology was more often used to kill than to repair. It made people realize what depravity and destruction man was capable of. It was a huge blow to the old ideas of Romanticism, which would continue to be broken down throughout the 20th century. After World War I, the Western world experienced a massive economic crash, by far the greatest economic downturn in modern history. It would come to be known as the Great Depression, and it weakened trust in banks, economic policy, and government. Poverty was rampant, and many were forced to leave their homes in search of new jobs. Some Americans drove Hoover carts, cars pulled by horses, as they were so destitute they didn't even have money for fuel. But it was not simply the banks that failed. Many pointed fingers at government. Many believed the U.S. government was as untrustworthy as the failing banks.
A Washington dispatch from March 8, 1930 stated, President Hoover predicted today that the worst effect of the crash upon unemployment will have passed within the next 60 days. However, by the mid-1930s, over 22% of U.S. citizens were unemployed.
Worldwide trade had fallen by 50%. In 1930, U.S. Secretary of Labor James Davis said, "The worst is over without a doubt." But by 1933, 11,000 of the United States' 25,000 banks had completely failed. Many countries were affected far more seriously than America. Germany's inflation was so bad that in 1923, the price of butter was 2 trillion times higher than it was during World War I. That's like the United States government blowing the entire national debt on a Happy Meal.
While economies did recover, the Great Depression had a lasting influence on the Western world. The Great Depression destroyed the fortunes and wealth of millions. It made some people very, very desperate.
Some turned to communism, and some, in Germany, supported a new politician, a man who promised to get their country back on track and make it strong and glorious once again. This man was a young fascist named Adolf Hitler. The devastation of the Great War was unique. The destruction unleashed in it was truly horrific. Yet, within 2 decades, the world was drawn into World War II, the single most destructive war in all of human history. Over 2,000 Americans died in the initial attack on Pearl Harbor, but it was nothing compared to other battles. In the Battle of Stalingrad, on average, over 9,900 men died every day. The Battle of Stalingrad lasted 199 days. The average life expectancy for a Soviet officer was 3 days. For a new Soviet recruit, 1 day. Before the 2 world wars, men had hoped that humanity would arise into greatness, but this was not the case. Dwight D. Eisenhower, who served as the supreme commander of the Allied forces and later became president, said, "I hate war only as a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity." The end of the war brought more fear because of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here, the U.S. dropped 2 atomic bombs, killing over 60% of local civilians. This was not simply a more powerful cannon or better gun. In the atomic bomb, man created something that could destroy everything. People understood this, and no words were as fitting as those of Oppenheimer, the chief physicist on the atomic bomb project. He said, "We knew the world would not be the same. A few laughed, a few cried, most were silent. I was reminded of an ancient Hindu text. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." John F. Kennedy was the first U.S. president born during the 20th century and clearly represented hope in the future. After 2 world wars and the largest economic collapse in history, people needed someone to hope in. He quickly became one of the most popular presidents in American history. Despite winning the 1960s election with only 0.1% of the popular vote, by 1962 he had a 78% public approval rating and was Time's Person of the Year. Yet 1 year later he was dead, assassinated while driving through downtown Dallas on a political trip. Kennedy was the embodiment of hope in the future. He wanted peace talks with the Soviet Union. He wanted to begin withdrawing the 16,000 U.S. soldiers overseas in Vietnam, and had plans to reduce the CIA and the Federal Reserve. Kennedy was a loved president. He represented a government that desired peace, not war. Yet his life ended in violence and conspiracy. In his death, a certain optimism died. Kennedy's plans came to nothing, and under the next administration, the number of soldiers in Vietnam swelled quickly to over 500,000, setting the stage for the tragedy of the Vietnam War.
Just as the Romantics responded to the industrial age through art, poetry, and music, so did the anti-establishment movement of the late 1960s, which sprung up as a result of the Vietnam War. Man was beginning to lose his natural state of freedom, and Vietnam was a clear example of that. Because unlike all the preceding wars in this country, we were not attacked. Vietnam was a humanitarian front on the side of American interest, and the problem with that was that people were being forced to fight it. It is through this that man has lost his freedom, and the Romantics greatly frowned upon that. During the 18th century, urbanization was overwhelming the world. The age of technology and science was forcing man to become a slave to the machines of the new metropolis. However, a group of intellectuals gathered together to revive a conventional way of thinking which has been long lost and forgotten. It is this mentality that is projected through the magnificent arts of music and poetry, which illustrates the great wonders and divinity of nature by the Romantics. Not like today, when art is but diminished to a bit of graffiti in a bathroom, a wheel on a chair, or a black slab of paint over a beautiful canvas. The draft of Vietnam, the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the First and Second World Wars, and the Great Depression have all contributed toward a decline in confidence in the established order. These tragic events in history have molded a callous over society, which has covered up all the emotion, feeling, and self-expression of the Romantics. Has the death of Romanticism come with a price? You decide. Paint over a beautiful canvas. We're going to do that again. Let's see it again. Because I was like, oh, where? And that's the cutscene, right?
We're no strangers to love. You know the rules, and so
Industrial age of... Oh my god! We were walking too slow.
What?
We were walking, that was it.
We didn't go out the door.
Yeah, but that was it. We need to be paced.
That wasn't it.
No, that was it.
So why didn't you go out the door? Now I have to do it again. And we're done.